Hey folks, I'm Miranda. I woke up this morning and my mind was full of the Tulsa Massacre, so I thought I'd talk about it before I've even had my coffee. As I've mentioned in other videos, I get really annoyed that American history isn't taught comprehensively in our schools. So as a result, we don't learn from the mistakes of our predecessors. So let me please help educate you so that we all grow together. Today, I'm going to teach you about the Tulsa Massacre, and I'm going to briefly touch on a couple of the other massacres that have happened in the United States because we need to learn from them. The history of the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street, it starts with our shared history with the First Nations peoples of the United States. I don't think you can tell the story of Greenwood without mentioning the First Nations peoples. In 1829, President Andrew Jackson refused to treat the First Nations people as individual ethnic groups. He just grouped them all together. Now, he pursued and aggressively advanced the Indian Removal Act, which forced the removal of 5 nations: the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole, and the Cherokee. All these nations held their land and their sovereignty independent of the United States. And President Jackson didn't like that. He forced them all out west of the Mississippi. A lot of them ended up on what we now call Indian reservations in Oklahoma. I'm not going to dive too deeply into this topic, but I encourage you to research the history of the Indian Removal Act. It was awful, and it advanced the genocide of several ethnic groups. The Indian Removal Act is very important to the history of Black Wall Street because we Black people were a part of those nations. Some of us were part of those nations as slaves, others of us were part of it as freed people. So a population of Black folks ended up in Oklahoma and in Tulsa with the Native Americans, and a lot of their descendants were victims in the Tulsa Massacre. After the Emancipation Proclamation, more Black folks migrated to Oklahoma, seeking and gaining their fortune in the rich oil fields or in mining. Some of them were just seeking refuge from racial prosecution all over the United States, and it was all these people that settled in Tulsa. Now you have Tulsa with a burgeoning Black population that are all working and making money, and some of them were quite affluent. And the Greenwood District, where all the Black people settled, it was purposefully prosperous. Community members strategized to create a really strong economy, and they planned the areas of economic growth. The community was formally organized in 1906, adopting the name Greenwood after another successful Black settlement. Look it up. By 1921, it was home to about 10,000 Black residents, and it thrived. It had very successful businesses, including banks, libraries, and grocery stores. For instance, a wealthy Black entrepreneur named J.B. Stanford built this beautiful, lush hotel so that he could offer the same amenities to Black folks that white folks received in their hotels, but that we didn't have access to. It was the largest Black-owned hotel of its time, and it was gorgeous. On the main road all along Greenwood Avenue, there were doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs and real estate agents. It was thriving. It's been well documented that all this prosperity started to intimidate white residents. They wrote angry letters to Black business owners. They didn't like that Greenwood was growing and its boundaries were starting to push against the white areas of town. They didn't like the prosperity that was there, and they told them to stop it. Like they were just going to stop it. Even newspaper articles asserted that the white residents were getting really annoyed by the growth of Greenwood. The Black population was well over 12% across Oklahoma. People didn't like that. And ongoing racial tensions with the First Nations peoples, it was a powder keg. It's critical that you understand this history and the climate that was in Tulsa at the time. You also need to know that this all happened just after World War I. Tulsa was full of veterans. Early morning, the 30th of May, 1921, racial tensions were high when Dick Rowland stepped onto an escalator operated by a young white woman named Sarah Page. The details of that elevator ride circulated around Tulsa, and it changed with each telling, and the final rumor seemed to be that Dick Rowland sexually assaulted Sarah Page. This was unsubstantiated. Early morning, the 31st of May, 1921, the police arrested Mr. Rowland, took him to the courthouse, and then they had to barricade the courthouse, saying that they were keeping Mr. Rowland safe. That is not what they were doing. That morning, the Tulsa Tribune printed an article that Mr. Rowland sexually assaulted Miss Page, and they also announced that there was a lynching plan for that night, because back then they scheduled lynchings. No proof was needed, they just lynched. On the evening of the 31st of May, a white mob descended on the courthouse where Mr. Rowland was barricaded up with the sheriff and his deputies. They were intent on lynching. A group of Black armed protesters showed up at the courthouse to protect Mr. Rowland. Then it all went down. Shots were fired, a white guy got killed, and the Black people were outnumbered, so they were run off back to Greenwood. Then the sheriff deputized and armed members of that mob, and they all headed off to Greenwood to handle the Black people. Early morning, the 1st of June, 1921, This mob went into Greenwood and began rioting and looting. They burned it all down. Witnesses say that veterans just shot black people on sight. It was an absolute massacre. There's no other word for what this was. Eventually, the governor called in the National Guard. They started putting out fires. They stopped all the shooting and the rioting. But they also rounded up all the black people, those that were in custody by the white mob, and the ones that were just walking free. Between 6,000 and 8,000 people were interred for no reason, people who had done nothing. They were held at the convention hall and the fairgrounds for up to 8 days. So what are the stats? Over 300 people were killed, over 800 people were hospitalized with injuries, over 1,200 residences and 35 city blocks were absolutely destroyed, just gone. Property damage is estimated to be about $1.8 million. In today's money, that's about $30 million. To be fair, and Lord knows we need some fairness, the governor ordered a grand jury to investigate everything. Nobody was held accountable, not one person. They blamed all the black people. They said that we were rioting and causing problems. So it's our fault that they had to burn us and bomb us to the ground. This massacre affected Tulsa for generations. Now, originally, this whole massacre was called the Tulsa Race Riot in 1921, and it was called that for a reason. That protected insurance companies, and they did not have to pay out to the black business owners who lost everything. It was highly suspected that it was planned, and that's why the National Guards got there so quickly. We don't know. What we do know is that it's not an isolated incident. This tragedy wasn't the only one of its kind. It was just probably the most well organized. In 1923, the Rosewood Massacre was also provoked by an unsubstantiated accusation of sexual assault of a white woman by a black man. And although not on the economic level of Greenwood, Rosewood was also a thriving area. And if you think that's all just in the past, 1921 and 1923, and we just need to get over it, what about 1985? In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the police were sent to execute an arrest warrant for several members of a black liberation group. This group had a contentious relationship with law enforcement. When the group didn't open their doors or respond to the police commissioner then ordered the bombing of the house.
State police helicopter drops it. There is the explosion.
They just dropped the bombs from helicopters. All of that for one house. 500 officers shot 10,000 rounds of ammo with automatic weapons at the house. And if that wasn't enough, they let the fires rage all across the community, leaving 250 people homeless.
You made the decision to drop a damn bomb on my house. You ruined my life. At the bunker, they decided physically to let the bunker burn. They knew they was gonna burn down the whole neighborhood. Who gave them people that power?
No one was ever held accountable for this crime. Look, I share all of this with you to provide insight into race relations in the United States and to give you a more comprehensive version of our history. In case you didn't know, every time there's been a black prosperous area in the United States, it has been burned to the ground. Yet we are always accused of being shiftless. We don't want to have anything. We're always destroying our own neighborhoods. But it is not us who are consistently destroying our neighborhoods. If you don't believe me, look it up. These are all Googleable facts. That's the only kind of information I provide you. I hope that learning all of this benefits you as much as it helps me in sharing it. Part of my pain as a black person is that I feel like I'm complicit in my own abuse because we're silent about atrocities. We don't speak to them, and it's time for us to speak to them. That's it. I think I'm done. Thank you for listening. I'll chat to you soon. Bye.